Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links is probably Konami's most popular video game of all time, or at least it was before the Maxi minigame game released. Duel Links released on November 17, 2016, and has, over the years, accrued over 140 cards in its card pool, which is insane! Jokes aside, I actually wanted to know how many cards there were in Duel Links, but I couldn't find any official sources. So I went to the game and I decided to start counting for myself, and then I got bored because there's too many cards. So I checked on Wikipedia, and they say there's like 8,000 cards, and they haven't updated their Duel Links card pool in a while, so let's say there's like 10,000 or something. Yeah, that seems correct. And among these 10,000 cards, only a select few have stood out over the years and ingrained themselves in the minds of the many players throughout the different eras of this game. Today we pay homage to 10 of the most iconic Duel Links cards of all time. Before we get started, I want to let you all know that this list is going to go by chronological order, which means we're gonna look at oldest cards first and newest cards last. The reason I did this is because I did not want to rank the cards by a subjective metric that would be iconicity, which is a word that I just made up, I'm pretty sure. Oh, no, that's a real word. Huh. Well, the more you know. Number 10. Sphere Karibo. Sphere Karibo released in the game's very first main box, The Ultimate Rising. It was a main box UR and already one of the most coveted cards of the time. In fact, it was so coveted that it might have been considered to be the best card in the game no matter what decks you were playing. And veteran players will remember the fear of never getting access to Sphere Karibo once again once Konami retired the first two boxes as it was initially planned. Fortunately, they never actually did that, so now you can still try and waste your gems to get a Sphere Karibo out of Ultimate Rising. But what made Sphere Karibo so good? First and foremost, it is a hand trap, meaning that it is a monster that activates its effect by discarding itself, which means that there is basically no ways to interact with it. It doesn't care whatsoever about back row removal. All the way back in 2016 and up to 2022 actually, there was very little monster effect negation in the game. So Sphere Karibo is pretty much a card that you can't really interact with. Adding on to that, the fact that it was a dark type monster will prove to be pretty important for a lot of Chaos decks later on the game's life cycle. And last but not least, Sphere Karibo proved particularly interesting against multi-attacker monsters, such as Chimeratech Rampage Dragon, a card which terrorized Duel Links from 2020 to 2021. Nowadays, Sphere Karibo has mostly been replaced by better hand traps, and even these don't see all that much play anymore, but it still makes the occasional appearance in top competing decks to this day. Most recently, people have touted Sphere Karibo as a way to deal with Lyrilusk Assembled Nightingale, a direct attacker that can attack multiple times. Number 9. Enemy Controller. Enemy Controller is a card that can be obtained by dueling Seto Kaiba at the gate and has been in the game since November 11th, 2016. It is essentially, to this day, a free-to-play card, meaning that you don't have to spend any money or currency to obtain it. And for a free-to-play card, it is incredibly powerful. So powerful in fact that people have discussed whether this card would actually ever be power crept or not for several years. Enemy Controller proved to be so powerful that it ended up being limited to in mid-2018 alongside a couple of generic and archetypal cards in order to make it less playable in those specific decks. It has stayed limited 2 for several years until it was finally moved to limited 1 in December 2022 in a massive ban list that addressed a lot of problematic decks at the time. But what made Enemy Controller such a powerful card that deserved being hit twice in the span of 4 years? Well, it's simple. As a quick play spell, it is incredibly versatile. The fact that you can use it both on the draw and on the go means that there's never really a point in which Enemy Controller is just sitting dead in your hand, completely useless. On top of that, the ability to sort of dodge back row by attributing a monster that would have been targeted by a Karma Cut or Floodgate Trample means that you're basically blanking removal while also dealing a huge blow to your opponent's resources. Because, and let's not forget the most important part of this effect, you're basically basically removing a monster from your opponent's field and using it as your own, whether it's for extra deck material or just simply attacking directly with it in order to secure lethal. There's never been a metagame in which enemy controller was obsolete. Nowadays, it's a kind of a different story. The fact that there's so many generic and archetypal cards on the limited one list means that you're gonna have to make a couple of concessions in order to include enemy controller in your deck, which you might not be able to if you're playing an archetypal deck that has one of its cards limited one. A true testament to enemy controller's power to this day is the fact that if it were to be unlimited, it would just be pretty much played in every deck to this day. It is just that good, which is why it's probably never leaving the limited one list to begin with. Number 8. Lava Golem. Lava Golem came alongside Yami Marek, who was released on July 26, 2017 as a one-off in his starter deck, though it was later made available at more copies through events. Lava Golem also bears the distinction of being, to this day, the only card that received a printed nerf after its released in Duel Links. Said nerf was part of the burn damage overhaul that happened in September 2020 with the Zexal Word release in order to reduce the impact of burn cards throughout duels. Lava Golem specifically saw its burn damage halved from 1000 damage to 500. This of course followed the Desol era, during which Lava Golem could pretty consistently be found in a variety of decks, especially in tournaments where it safely resided in the side deck waiting to be used in otherwise problematic matchups. But what made Lava Golem so good? First and foremost, it is basically the first kaiju we ever got in Duel Links. Though it did take your normal summon, the ability to remove problematic boss monsters on your opponent's side of the field is not to be understated, even at the time where boss monsters weren't all that impressive. Adding on to that, it basically burned you for a quarter of your life points every turn, which meant that the duel could be ended in 4 turns if your opponent didn't find a way to remove it. Which again, all the way back in Desol era, we didn't have Xyz monsters. The pool of synchros that could use Lava Golem was actually really small, and link plays only existed in players' wildest imagination. And last but not least, though the obvious drawback of giving your opponent a free monster is that they just get to punch you in the face with it, there were several ways even back then to deal with Lava Golem very specifically, some of which ended up being put on the forbidden and limited list because of Lava Golem. Nowadays, Lava Golem just pales in comparison to the actual kaiju that made their way into Duel Links, but there are still decks out there that would rather attribute 2 monster and lose their normal than simply 1, and Lava Golem certainly left a mark on the Duel Links community that could not be understated. Number 7. Cosmic Cyclone. Cosmic Cyclone came in the main box Galactic Origin on November 6, 2017. For comparison's sake, Mystical Space Typhoon did not release until Antinomic Theory on February 28, 2021, which is to say almost 4 years later. Cosmic Cyclone's role as the prime back row removal spell for several years led it to be limited 3 on March 2020, actually being one of the first limit 3 cards in the entire game, meaning that if you wanted to have easy access to back row removal, you better have to make some concessions about your meta deck. To this day, the limited 3 list still counts around 40 cards, some of which are archetypal, some of which are generic, all of which have the potential to have a gigantic impact on the metagame. However, you'll notice Cosmic Cyclone is not actually on this list displayed on screen anymore, because it was graciously let go from the limited 3 list on December 2022 in the same ban list that put enemy controller to limited 1. We're gonna mention this backlist a couple more times in this video. Even then, it was still being acknowledged as a very powerful card, but why is that? Simply put, Cosmic Cyclone banishes back row, and in several cases this is better because there's some back row that flirts or some back row that can be retrieved. Think of the Unchained cards for instance, or how Salamangreat players can just retrieve a destroyed Salamangreat Sanctuary with Falco or Sunlight Wolf. If you just banish that back row, it's never coming back, it's basically out of the duel forever. Not only that, but having to pay 1000 life points in order to activate played it, was often used as an advantage rather than an issue. Throughout the history of Duel Links, there were a lot of skills that could be triggered after losing 1,000 life points. Sorcery Conduit, Switcheroo, Casey Bling, all of them really loved having to pay a very specific amount of life points in order to get accessed. And last but not least, as mentioned with Enemy Controller, being a quick play means that it's always ready to be used, where cards like Dust Tornado had to be set before being really useful, and cards like Galaxy Cyclone weren't exactly good on the play since there was no way for you to actually use them during your opponent's turn. To this day, Cosmic Cyclone still sees occasional play in top tier deck lists. It does suffer from competition from Mystical Space Typhoon, but there are enough scenarios in which banishing a back row is better than destroying it for it to justify its use. It really makes you think, doesn't it, that we got a card so powerful so early in Duel Links' lifespan. Speaking of which, number 6 is none other than Hatrunade. Hatrunade released on March 13th, 2018, which is funny because that's just a month after its actual TCG release as a secret rare in a set that dismissed it completely because it wasn't playable in a TCG. It's not a good TCG card. But in the context of Duel Links specifically, it proved to be incredibly powerful. So powerful, in fact, that just a couple of months later, Hatrunade would be limited to, putting firmly alongside Enemy Controller in the category of generic staple that could help you win the game instantly, where it would be joined by a couple more cards over the years. It actually became a meme in the Duel Links community that whenever a new deck with OTK capabilities ended up being released, they would immediately rush to use Hatrunade, have massive competitive success with it, and then be forced by the ban list to drop it altogether. For years, there were several archetypal cards being put to limited 2 just so the associated deck would not be able to use Hatrunade, which is why it eventually ended up being banned altogether in July 2021, where it has remained to this day being one of the few banned cards in the game. Of course, that doesn't stop people that never actually played with or against Runade from thinking that it is a completely healthy card that can come back. And all of these people are wrong. Here's why Hatrunade is such a powerful card that it can never come back in any format whatsoever. By simply activating it, you're removing a lot of interaction on your opponent's side of the field, which means that you're basically free to do whatever you want, and that's it. That's all that it does. But it is enough for me to argue that this card can absolutely never come back to Duel Links whatsoever, no matter the stakes, no matter the situation. And if you want to disagree with me on this point, can you imagine top tier decks like Hero or Salamangreat being able to play Hatrunade? Is this really the kind of format that you want for the game? Number 5. Treacherous Trap Hole. Treacherous Trap Hole released in the Visions of Ice mini-box on May 1st, 2018. Isn't that funny how mini-boxes used to have good cards in them? Much like Hatrunade, Treacherous Trap Hole would end up on the Limited 2 list on October 2018, where it has pretty much remained since. That is, until the infamous December 2022 ban list moved it to Limited 1, specifically mentioning Enemy Controller as a reason why Tretch was moved to Limited 1 is incredibly funny to me. What's even funnier is that the community seemed divided on the actual impact Treacherous specifically would have on the game, with many people just brushing it off, when it ended up being, in fact, one of the most played, if not the most played trap cards for several years. But what made Treacherous Trap Hole so good? Simply put, you get to remove 2 of your opponent's monster for basically free, and that's it. That's all that it needed to do, and that's all that it ended up being used for, and it still was incredibly powerful. Even in the worst case scenario out there, where you were using it to pop one of your monster and a very important monster on your brand side of the field, it was still a decent trade. Especially if your monster ended up having protection, or something that made it so you could keep it after trying to pop it. The flexibility of being able to pop only one of your opponent's monster if needed and one of yours, in some corner cases scenario, is also one of the greatest asset that this card has. And last but not least, about the not having trap cards in your graveyard parts, that's usually something that people very easily built around because, simply put, there were no trap cards worth putting in your deck all the way back in 2018. Of course, this has changed over the years with the release of format-defining staples like Floodgate Trap Hole, Karma Card, Compulse. So you would think that Treacherous Trapple would lose in popularity after all those years, but as we've been getting better trap cards, we've also been getting better spell cards. The Forbidden cards, including the most recent release of Droplets, Book of Moon, and then Book of Eclipse. There's now enough good spells in the game that playing Tretch isn't all that costly for your deck, which is why it still sees occasional play in a variety of decks to this day. Honorable mention, Neos Fusion. Neos Fusion released on March 16th, 2019 in the structure deck EX Neos Fusion. That's the same name as the card. But it did not come alone, for it released alongside the card that would most often be used alongside it, Elemental Hero Brave Neos. This fusion monster has the very specific materials of one Elemental Hero Neos and one level 4 or lower effect monster. And that effect monster could be anything, which it ended up being, seeing how widely played Neos Fusion was for several years. There was of course Cyberdark Neos, where you would use Neos Fusion to foolish a Cyberdark cannon and then equip it to the normal summon of Cyberdark Edge, or simply to send a bacon saver to, well, save your bacon. There was Subterran Neos, where you would use Neos Fusion to send an AD changer so that you could later change the battle position of a set Subterra monster on your field. There was Pure Neos, which didn't actually play that many Neos cards, but very funnily played Gale Lizard, because a flipped Gale Lizard at 1400 attack, which on top of the Brave Neos that was at 2600 because of the Neos in the graveyard, meant that you had an easy way to lethal your opponents, which is incredibly funny to think about. There was Kwaikai Meiru Neos, where there's not even synergy between Kwaikai Meirus and Neos Fusion, but you can still send Bacon Saver and AD Changer in order to dodge battle and floodgate trapples, so that's still worth playing. And of course, there was eventually Invoked Neos, where you would be able to foolish some fusion material to use for your invoked fusions later on. The versatility of this pseudo-foolish burial effect led to Neos Fusion being limited 2 on October 2019, which actually didn't do all that much to stop its competitive usage. After all, with the release of another hero structure deck, Neos Fusion got to get played in an actual hero-centric deck, summoning a big beta and then activating Necro Valley from deck. And of course, Invoked Neos ended up being stronger than ever with the release of Purgatrio, and the very disposable Volcanic Shell that could be used as discard fodder for the Karma Cuts and Ultimate Providences of this deck. This eventually led to Neos Fusion being moved from Limited 2 to Limited 3 in order to make it more accessible, but replacing it on the ban list with Brave Neos being moved to Limited 2, which actually happened just in time for the new Hero Alliance deck to get access to one more copy of Neos Fusion. Hey, isn't that funny? Later on, Neos Fusion would be removed from the Forbidden list altogether in November 2023, and just a couple of months ago, Elemental Hero Brave Neos would be removed as well. And hey, look at that! Isn't that interesting? How another hero card was removed at the same time in order to promote a deck that everyone absolutely loved. And that's pretty much why I put Neos Fusion in the honorable mention rather than on the actual list. It used to be a generic way to foolish any card that you wanted, a really cool sub-engine in your deck, but nowadays it's just a hero card, and that's all it's being used for anymore. Number 4. Invoked Cositus. Invoked Cositus famously released in the Dark Dimension main box, one of the strongest main box in the history of Duel Links to this day, on September 26th, 2019. As mentioned before, it saw play in the Invoked Neos deck, where it proved to be an incredibly resilient world and a capable beta as well, but it also saw play in pure Invoked variants, where it protected your bacon until you could drop a fat Black Rose Dragon thanks to Alistair and Scrap Goblin, before using Invocation to summon Purgatrio or Magellanica for lethal. Invoke Cositus Reigns of Terror obviously doesn't end here. We all remember the absolute fun that was Element Sabers invoked, and this is the deck that actually led Invoke to be Limited 1 on December 2019, which still didn't stop Invoked variants from thriving with new releases, such as Invoked Magician Girls or Invoked Viecroids. Cositus ended up being so good that it justified using Viecroids. Viecroids is a deck there's actual tournaments and KC Cup tops thanks to Invoked very specifically. Eventually, Konami bit the bullet and ended up banning Invokocitis in December 2020 and only walked back this decision 4 years later by putting Invokocitis back to 1, where it has conflicted with Invoked Mikaba since. Oops. But what, pray tell, made Invokocitis so good? Well, for the time, it was an incredibly hard monster to remove. It had protection from targeting and destruction by card effects, and it has somewhat beefy stats as well. Stats that could get beefier in the battle phase by discarding the Alistair that naturally recycled itself, so that you would have to deal with a 3900 defense monster that pretty much the only way of destroying it back then was by battle. Like I mentioned before, it is now conflicting with Invoke Mikaba, which is why the card hasn't seen all that much play ever since its release from the ban list. And adding onto that, we now have more ways to deal with Invokocitis either being on the field or being set up to be summoned through an invocation than before. Number 3. Kytroid. Kytroid is a card that was first accessible only through a bingo mission from the tour guide all the way back in 2019, and then made more widely accessible in the card trader in January 2020. Also, it's worth mentioning that this is an anime exclusive card that showed up twice in the anime and only once in a duel. The other time it was used as a means of transportation, and that was the first time that it was actually used. So they had Cyrus use Kytroid to fly around, and then they were like, hey, what if we made it into a card that's being used in exactly one duel? And then they put it in Duel Links. Thanks! Even before it became widely available in the card trader, Kytroid ended up being limited too, which in my opinion shows that the card never had any use that wasn't completely degenerate even back then. Of course, Kytroid still saw a lot of play, and even worse, it ended up having a partner in crime in the form of Megaroid City. For the low price of destroying a card you controlled, you could search Kytroid. You could just put Kytroid into your hand. As seen before, this strategy ended up being used in a wide variety of decks, including the aforementioned Invoked Droids, which I'm sorry that you have to see this deck list again, but that's what the video is gonna be. Fire Kings, which also played 3 copies of Battling Boxer Veil, and eventually Gandora, which could easily swarm the field and provide a card to buff with the Kytroid anyway. You'll also notice the presence of White Princess over here, another very fun battle hand trap to play against. The latter deck is the straw that broke the camel's back and ended up getting Megaroid City limited 2 in order to prevent it from being paired up with Kytroid very specifically. It's even what Konami said in their little ban list explanation thingy. But what Kytroid good, why? It saves your ass. That's all that Kytroid does. You discard it, you take no battle damage. And even worse than that, it does so twice. No wonder this card ended up being so frustrating for the community. You think you've won the duel and then your opponent reveals that they were never in any danger to begin with. And the fact that it is a free-to-play card means that to this day, this card is still something that you have to consider when you think that you have lethal but your opponent has one card remaining in hand. Thanks, Konami! Number 2. Chaos Dragon L'Avenir. Chaos Dragon L'Avenir came in a selection box, which is a sign that it was going to be a very fair and balanced card. It initially released on March 2020, before being added to the game proper outside of a selection box in the Infinite Ray main box on December 2020. 9 months later, Chaos Dragon L'Avenir ended up being adopted really quickly by, well, Chaos decks that were looking for a very powerful win condition, and it slotted super easily into Thunder Dragon Lightsworns. However, this then led to Thunder Dragon Lightsworns being forced to part ways through a ban list that put Dragon Dark Gold Sarcophagus and Charge of the Light Brigade to limited 3, so much like a child with divorced parents, Chaos Dragon L'Avenir ended up seeing play in both pure Thunder Dragons and pure Lightsworns instead. Eventually, this was also addressed with L'Avenir being put on the limited 3 list alongside Dragon Dark. Oh yeah, they took Dragon Dark out of the limited 3 list for a while and then put it back on in December 2021 alongside L'Avenir, which didn't actually do all that much to stop L'Avenir from being played in other decks that could put Lights and Darks in their graveyard. Hey! Here's that Gandora deck list from before again. Eventually, Melody of the Awakening Dragon, which could be used to search Lavinia, was moved from Limited 1 to Limited 3, which was touted as a way to make Dragon decks more flexible, but came with the caveat that it was now conflicting with the best card that it could search. However, in November 2023, Melody was eventually freed, and though Chaos Dragon Lavinia remains on the ban list to this day, it is still powerful enough to justify play in decks that put light and dark monsters in their graveyard, including Borrow Link, that plays 3 copies of Melody of Awakening Dragon, pretty much only to search it and it very specifically. But why? Chaos Dragon Lavinia was an incredibly removal tool for the time, being able to destroy 2 cards on the field without targeting them, which means that if they wanted to use the back row before Lavinia popped it, they had to activate it in response to the Lavinia effect, and then Lavinia would just be like, okay, I'm gonna pop something else then, cause use your back row. For the time, it also had insane synergies with the Thunder Dragons very specifically. Banishing them for cast meant that you also get to activate your Thunder Dragons effect, and even back in 2021, you were able to chain block a couple of negation effects like Fallen Strike Bouncer, simply because Lavinia activated as Chain Link 1 and Dragon Dark would activate as Chain Link 2. And last but not least, even though it could not attack the turn that it was summoned and used its effect, it was still a pretty impressive body that could be used for rank 8 plays or link plays, or would just be an overall menace sitting on your field, waiting to be taken care of. Eventually, Blackluster Soldier released also in a selection box. Isn't that funny? But it did not really ever compete with Lavinia. In fact, both were used in tandems in several decks. What I'm trying to say is, to this day, Lavinia is just one Chaos deck away from going all bonkers once again. When are Bestials coming to Duel Links, do you think? And last and certainly not least, number 1, Book of Moon. Much like the previous card, Book of Moon released as a selection box exclusive all the way in January 2021, and was only added to the game proper 10 months later in Chaotic Soldiers on November 2021. It wasn't really appreciated by the community, being an objective pay-to-win staple that proved to be incredibly powerful even for the time, earning itself the affectionate nickname of Book of Money, because you had to spend a lot of money to get your hands on 3 copies of Book of Moon. However, even after the official release of Book of Moon, it proved to be one of the best staples in the game for literal years, as indicated by the screenshot from May 2023, where it comfortably sits behind Cosmic Cyclone, which was at the time recently made widely available through box chips as one of the most used cards of the entire game. However, this will later change for several reasons, one of which is that we currently live in hell where Hero is the most played and most popular deck by a long shot, and the second of which is that we got so many better cards than Book of Moon since then. But why Book good? The reason you used it in 2021 is pretty much the same reason you're using it now. You just get to neutralize any monster that your opponent controls. Whether it's a boss monster or something that they were planning to use for Synchro or Xyz plays, flip that fucker down and that's no longer an issue. Additionally, even all the way back in 2021, there were scenarios in which you could use Book of Moon to protect your own stuff. For instance, Karma Cards could not get rid of a monster that was targeted by it and then flip face down by Book of Moon. Nowadays, I guess you're using it to dodge Veiler, which is still somewhat impressive. And yeah, of course, it's a quick play spell, which, as with Cosmic Cyclone and Enemy Controller, means that is good whether you're playing first or second. However, like I mentioned before, Book of Moon fell off. The release of Book of Eclipse certainly didn't help its case, and even worse than that, what's the point of flipping a monster face down when you can just negate its effect and reduce its attack instead? Forbidden Droplet is also a huge competition for Book of Moon, especially considering neither is on the Limited 3 list at the moment. And despite it all, it can't be argued otherwise that Book of Moon is still one of the most influential cards to ever get released in Duel Links very specifically, and is the perfect card to round up my top 10 list of the most iconic Duel Links cards of all time. Thank you for watching this video, everyone. I hope that you enjoyed it. This is an idea that I had just before falling asleep a couple of days ago, and I thought that would be a fun video. I'm usually complaining about Duel Links. How about I pay homage to the stuff that happened before, and I still found a way to complain anyway. If you like this type of content and would like to see more, make sure to let me know in the comments, and also like and subscribe to the channel if you will. I would really appreciate that. Additionally, if you'd like to support me further, please check my Ko-fi link in the video description, where you can make a one-time donation or a monthly pledge. I would like to thank my Ko-fi donators in the form of Dingust, OurDishBoy0, Jimmy, Zinnia, Yannick, Seal, Mark Lu, Fortuner16, the Abyssactor Guru, Alt Price and X Assist. Thank you all for the support. And that's it. That's the video. I'm not sure what type of video I'm gonna make next. I have a couple of ideas. None of them are good though. Take care everyone, and I will see you all next time.